evidence as to whether bilinguals can process pitch content in accordance with the language that they're hearing. So I'm looking at speakers of and learners of both English, which is an intonation language, and Mandarin, which is a tone language. So our broader focus is whether bilinguals process speech sounds in accordance with the language that they're hearing. So can they process speech sounds differently in their two languages? And if they are capable of that, what cues cause them to shift? So this is an interesting question because if you imagine what would make an optimal bilingual, since languages differ in what acoustic information they use to do things like differentiate words, the optimal processor would be able to shift their processing strategies to take advantage of what's going to be relevant in the particular language. But it's possible that bilinguals are not capable of this. One possibility is that whichever language is currently dominant is going to just determine how speech sounds get processed, or that the language that people learned first, so their native language, is going to do that. We're also interested in when in development children can do this. So I'm going to be presenting evidence from both adults who are already fairly established in being bilingual in two languages, as well as from preschoolers who are still potentially sorting out the two languages that they're learning. And the acoustic dimension that we're focusing on in particular is fundamental frequency, which perceptually we describe as pitch. So I'll be referring to it as pitch. Pitch plays a crucial role in the way that parents communicate with young infants. So in this example, the mother is saying, "You're a good little baby," which I tried to indicate with this red line, the ups and downs of the speech, the pitch pattern. And that pattern, infant-directed speech has a particular style of pitch that tends to have broad pitch range and a higher pitch mean than when we speak to adults. Those characteristics help attract the infant's attention to the parent's voice and help do things like convey emotions, like happiness or sadness, and also indicate pragmatic functions, so the mother can express approval to the baby or prohibit the baby from doing something like, no, don't touch that cord. Pitch is also used, so what I just described are fairly universal ways that pitch is important in infant-directed speech, but pitch is used at other levels of structure that vary across languages. So in tone languages like Mandarin, pitch actually distinguishes words. So if a speaker of Mandarin says something like ma, a low dipping tone, versus ma, a high level tone, even though the syllable contains the same consonants and vowels, and to English speakers sounds like the same syllable, to Mandarin speakers this indicates a pretty dramatic contrast between the meaning horse and mother. In English, as you may know, pitch can't differentiate words. So if I say horse or horse or horse, these all indicate the same, roughly the same meaning. So lexical pitch for bilinguals must be processed differently in the two languages if they're going to be optimal processors. So a bilingual would be best off if they attend to tones in Mandarin but disregard lexical pitch in English. So for bilinguals, things are more complicated than for monolinguals. It's not enough to just learn whether pitch does or doesn't differentiate words in your language. They must process pitch in accordance with the language context that they're currently hearing. So we're interested in whether bilinguals can attend to tones in Mandarin and disregard really similar information in English. So the first study was postdoctoral work I conducted at UC San Diego at the Center for Research in Language with Sarah Creel. And I want to first acknowledge the many contributors to this project. So we had several bilingual undergraduates who helped us recruit and test subjects. They're on the top row. And then we had Sally Cho was a Mandarin-English bilingual who produced our stimuli. And then I had several consultants who have expertise either in bilingualism, like Tamar Golan and Roger Levy, or in Mandarin specifically, which actually includes Roger Levy, surprisingly, as well as Jing Shen and Crane Huang. So the specific questions we were interested in were First, do bilinguals attend more to pitch contours when they're learning words in Mandarin than when they're learning words in English? And second, does their ease of using tone or exploiting tone depend on their language experience? So we looked at this in two ways. First of all, whether people knew Mandarin at all. So we tested both Mandarin English bilinguals and monolingual English speakers. Actually, some of the monolinguals, what I'm calling monolinguals, actually were bilingual in other languages, but that didn't use tone. And then we also looked at, for bilinguals specifically, we looked at their current language dominance. We tested 48 speakers of English who hadn't had exposure to a tone language, and 72 Mandarin English bilinguals. Now, the bilinguals were all native speakers of Mandarin, but their age of acquisition of English actually ranged very widely. So when I use the word bilingual, I'm not using the sort of traditional linguistics definition where people are native bilinguals in both languages. I'm using this term more broadly to encompass anyone who's proficient in both languages. So to assess proficiency in both languages, we conducted two different language dominance assessments. The first one is the multilingual naming test, or the MINT, which Tamar Golan is actually developing at UC San Diego. And in this, it's essentially a vocabulary assessment where bilinguals name pictures, a series of pictures in both languages. We counterbalanced which language they were naming in first, but they're naming the same set of pictures. And the pictures increase in difficulty. So we start out with simple names like apple and get a little lower frequency like pie, and then end up with even lower frequency words like rocket. And then the second assessment was the bilingual dominance scale developed by Dunn and Foxtree. And this is essentially a questionnaire, but that's been very carefully normed. So bilinguals answer 12 different questions and then get a score for their proficiency in each language. And there are two types of questions on the scale. The first assesses language background. Oh, yes?
For the first class, do reaction times count?
You can look at reaction times. We chose not to because it wasn't our primary measure. But yeah, it's designed so that you can administer it that way if you like. So on the bilingual dominance scale, the first type of question tried to assess people's language background. So basically their lifetime of experience with each language. So it asked things like, at what age did you first learn each language or feel comfortable speaking each language? And then the second type assessed their current language use. So it asked things like, which language do you use at home? And for undergraduates, we actually ended up breaking that down into in the dorms versus with your parents, because we get very different responses to those. And also questions like, when doing math in your head, which language do you use? So when we compared the responses on the MINT, the vocabulary assessment, and the bilingual dominance scale, and also people's age of arrival in the US, which we assessed with our own questionnaire, we found that all three of these measures were very highly correlated. So these are the correlation coefficients. So because all three were all highly correlated, when we computed our statistical analyses, we did look at all three, but we ended up primarily relying on the MINT. Yes?
The test that Jean Blair has for even perfect bilinguals is a little bit of a sad question. So imagine that out of an accident you are losing one of the two languages. One will be most likely to keep.
Yeah, that's one of the questions on the bilingual dominance scale. Yeah. Although you have to be careful with that question because sometimes people will answer strategically. So if they want to live in the U.S., they'll say, "Oh, I want English," even if Mandarin is dominant. So yeah, there are nuances to these things. But okay, so now I'm going to tell you about the tasks that we used. So we taught bilinguals a set of made-up words, and there were 16 words total, but they comprised 4 different quadruplets, and we designed them really carefully so that each word had an associated word that differed in either its tone pattern or in its vowel. So if you look at this word here, the arrow indicates that it had a rising tone in the first syllable, so it sounded like fee, p. If you go to the right, then we have a word where the first syllable differs only in its tone. So now it's fee-poo. And if you go down, the first syllable differs only in its vowel and has the same tone. So from fee-pee to fow-poo. And you may notice that the second syllables have divergent vowel as well. The reason for that was that we were also testing monolingual English speakers, and we wanted them to be able to learn this set of words without relying on tone, since it's not natural for them to do so. We used an eye tracking method where each participant was seated in front of a computer screen, and they would see 2 pictures on the screen at a time, and then a sentence would play over headphones, telling them which picture to click on. We were using made-up images and made-up words, and so these associations were completely arbitrary. So people would have to initially guess, and they'd receive feedback about which picture matched the word, and so over training they learned to make these associations. And we have this really cool iLink eye tracker that is able to compute where people are looking on the screen as they're listening to the sentence. So we use that we use that to tell which picture they were looking at as they were processing the sounds. So people first participated in this word learning phase, where they would see 2 pictures on the screen that we had paired so that they would have really dissimilar labels. So in this example, one of them is biofa and the other is fee-poo. And then they would hear a sentence like, choose the fee-poo. So like I said, initially they'd be guessing, and they would click on the picture that they thought might match the word. And then as they received more training, they had to reach about 90 or 95% correct on this phase to then move to the test phase. Then in the test phase, we got really tricky, and we started pairing pictures on at least a subset of trials that had really similar sounding names. So in the tone differentiated test trials, we're pairing this word fee-pee that has a rising tone in the first syllable versus fee-poo that has a falling tone. And then they're asked again, choose the fee-poo. And then in vowel differentiated trials, again, we're asking them choose the fee-poo in this example, but the other word has the same tone but a different vowel, so fow-poo. And in a between subjects manipulation, we manipulated whether the words were compatible with Mandarin or not compatible with Mandarin. So in the first condition, these words I've been showing you so far, we actually designed them initially to be equally compatible with the consonants and vowels and phonotactics of English and Mandarin, because we were initially trying to keep that constant and manipulate the extra word linguistic context. But we ended up doing this contrast where these words are compatible with Mandarin. And then we had another set where the words are incompatible with Mandarin, and they're only compatible with English phonotactics. So here we have a consonant cluster gra that doesn't occur in Mandarin, as well as vowels I and that occur in English but not Mandarin. And in the condition where the words were potentially compatible with Mandarin, we predicted that bilinguals would be more likely to pay attention to and use the tone information to differentiate these similar sounding words. Whereas when the words were only compatible with English and incompatible with Mandarin, we predicted that bilinguals would be less likely to pay attention to and use tone, and that English speakers, which we also tested in both conditions, shouldn't differ because they don't have any pre-existing knowledge of Mandarin or tones. So as I mentioned, we were able to use the eye tracking method to determine where people were looking on the screen as they processed the sentences. So then we could take that information and look at which picture they were looking at more over a particular time window that started 200 milliseconds after they heard that word, like fee-pee, and ended about 1,500 milliseconds after that. So here are the results. What we're looking at is basically over this time window, the amount of time people are looking at the target picture, so that the word is referring to, minus the amount of time they're looking at the other picture. And the blue lines are indicating the trials where the word pairs are disambiguated by their vowel information in the first syllable, and then the red lines are when they're differentiated by their tone information. So this first group is the bilinguals in the Mandarin context. So that's where words are things like fee-poo with these phonemes and phonotactics that are compatible with Mandarin. So we find an advantage for processing vowel information over tone information, which is a pattern we found in all the groups. And in another experiment, we determined that this was not so much, at least what we believe is that this is not so much an advantage for vowels in word representations generally, but we think it has more to do with the time course of how easy these things are to disambiguate. So tones tend to unfold over a slower time course in the word. So we think that this just has to do with how quickly people could identify and differentiate tones versus vowels. When bilinguals were learning words that were only consistent with English, oh, sorry, I forgot to say. So among this bilingual group learning Mandarin-like words, we found a relationship between people's dominance in Mandarin as assessed on this vocabulary test and how good they were at using tone information. So even though these are all native speakers of Mandarin, if we plot them according to their Mandarin dominance on the MINT, the vocabulary assessment, the people who are really strongly Mandarin dominant, so they have a strong, the score is calculated by taking their Mandarin score and subtracting their English score. So a high positive number means they're very dominant in Mandarin, and a very negative number means they're very dominant in English. And so we found this nice, basically linear relationship between their Mandarin dominance and how good they were at using the tone information. And then when we look at bilinguals in the English context, so learning words like gripu, we found our predicted effect where they're using tones less when the words are English-like than when the words are Mandarin-like. But surprisingly, so yeah, we find this decrease, but surprisingly we found a similar effect on the vowel processing as well. So it seems like when words are only compatible with English, Mandarin-English bilinguals are actually having a harder time using both vowels and tones to tell apart the words than when they're compatible with Mandarin. And then for English speakers, as we predicted, their responses didn't differ across the two contexts. So they're both about equally bad as the bilinguals in the English context. And when we looked at bilinguals in terms of their Mandarin dominance, basically there's kind of a gradient effect where the most Mandarin dominant bilinguals are better with both or with tones, and then as they get more and more English dominant, they start looking more like the monolingual English speakers. Yes.
Tone disambiguation
Mm-hmm.
is there, it's not zero, and it is the same by English talker, English speaker,
Across these three, right. Well, so I mentioned that we did also have that disambiguating information in the second syllable, and that was to enable English speakers to succeed in the task as well. So, so the difference we're seeing really has to do with whether they're using this tone information in the first syllable, which makes them faster and more efficient at. And actually, their accuracy was better as well in their clicking responses. But even for English speakers, they can wait until they get that vowel in the last syllable, and they can respond based on that. So they were less accurate and they were slower, but they're still, we gave them that information so that they could succeed, even if they'd completely ignore tone. So when we look at this effect of Mandarin dominance on tone processing, interestingly, we found that it only seemed to matter for the Mandarin-like words. So when we looked at the English-like words, this English-like word context, within word context, seemed to just nullify any effects of the people's proficiency in Mandarin versus English. So it suggests that when they're processing really English-like words, people are just not relying on their knowledge of Mandarin and their proficiency with tones. Whereas when they're learning Mandarin-like words, their proficiency and fluency in Mandarin is coming into play. So we found that bilinguals are using pitch more to tell apart the words that could be words of Mandarin compared with the words that could be, or that are only possibly words of English. But we also found similar effects of language context on the vowels. So there are a few possibilities for why that is. But one thing to think about is that the vowel information is distinct in the two sets of words. So in the Mandarin-like words, the vowels are potentially compatible with Mandarin, things like e and u. And in the English-like words, they're actually different vowels, things like I and whereas the tone information is the same in the two cases. And we actually, in a separate experiment, verified that that was the case, since I was actually producing the English words with an American English accent and everything. So there were lots of differences between the words, and we wanted to make sure that they were not also different in their tonal patterns. I was doing my best to kind of mimic the tonal patterns that the native speaker of Mandarin produced. And so we verified with a separate set of bilinguals that they were, in fact, equivalent in their tone information. So we know that the tone information was identical in the two cases, but even so, bilinguals are using it more in the Mandarin-like words than the English-like words. So it's possible that we're getting some kind of more general effect of familiarity with the words or with the sounds of the words that's making accessing the tone easier for people. But at least we can say for sure that that the acoustic information in the tones themselves is the same, yet we're seeing differences in how it's processed. And for English speakers, we found they were not affected by this change in the language context, which again makes sense because they don't have two language systems to access. They only have not pre-existing knowledge of English and have not been exposed to tones before. And then for bilinguals, we also found that their language dominance profiles only affected use of tone when the words were compatible with Mandarin, not when the words were compatible with English. So what is the nature of this language shifting? There are a couple of possibilities I want to mention. One is that so the way we were originally kind of conceiving of this was that the phonetic content of the words would cue bilinguals that they were in a Mandarin or an English context. And I kind of alluded to this before, but when we first started this work, we were really thinking at this level, and so we actually tried to control the within-word information and cue people using extra-word context, things like, so they would come into the lab and a research assistant would be speaking to them in either English or Mandarin, and then the words would be embedded in either Mandarin or English carrier phrases. So we really came into this work thinking at that level that whether, we wanted to see whether we could shift people into one processing mode or the other. But that manipulation actually didn't change bilinguals' tone processing, and what did change their processing was was the segmental information in the words themselves. So another possibility is that people's language knowledge, this sort of shifting of processing, is an emergent property of their lexicon. So it could be that they've, so over the course of their exposure to language, they've learned words in both Mandarin and English, and they tend to cluster based on properties like the consonants and vowels, or maybe the consistency of the pitch patterns. And so the Mandarin-sounding words in this experiment could have been sort of pulled into the Mandarin cluster in their lexical memory, whereas the English-sounding words were pulled into an English cluster. So that's another potential explanation that's at a different level for this finding. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk about children. So in the second study, we're asking, actually this is ongoing work, when bilingual children can match their pitch processing to the language context. So we found these effects on adults of the within-word segmental information that led them to process identical pitch information in different ways. So we're interested in when bilingual children can do this. And this is a collaboration with Leher Singh, who's a professor at the National University of Singapore. So it's an international collaboration that is very challenging because of the very large time difference. And this is also work with graduate student Annabelle Soon, and then we have 3 research assistants helping in Singapore, Callista Chen, Noah Tan, and Alina Tan. Singapore is a really interesting place to look at bilingualism because this is from the website yoursingapore.com. Most children grow up bilingual from infancy in Singapore, and English and Mandarin are the most commonly used languages. But children are learning mainly English in schools, although my collaborator tells me that actually the preschoolers mainly English in schools, but also learning their mother tongues to try to keep those up as well. And Singaporean English is also interesting. tip of Malaysia. So it gets a lot of influence from Malay, as well as the main ethnicity in Singapore is Chinese. So it has a lot of influence from the dialects of Chinese. Actually, I have a personal experience with Singaporean English because when I started college, my roommate turned out to be Singaporean. So during college, I got very good at detecting Singaporean English and like noticing the dialect around campus. And it's to me, it sounded like vaguely like British English, but a little sing-songy. So I'm hoping to play you videos where you'll get to hear it. We tested 2 groups of children, 23 English-speaking children. These are all children between 3 and 4 years of age, as well as 33 children who are bilingual in both Mandarin and English. So we were teaching children one word in an English context and one word in a Mandarin context. And because these are young children who generally, when you do developmental work, your effects tend to be less robust, and you have to. We just decided to basically start throwing every possible source of information at children as to which language context they were in, just to see whether we would see sensitivity to language context in the first place. So in the videos, we're manipulating both the sound, the within word segments like before, and also we're giving them a lot of contextual information. So this is the English context.
On a bright and sunny day, Lily was home with no one to play with. Just then, she saw her friend Elizabeth. Hello, Elizabeth. Hello, Lily. What are you doing here? I'm so happy to see you, Elizabeth. Would you like to play? Sure. I just got home from school and I really want to play. Great! Do you remember my birthday party on Sunday? I got this new toy from my mommy and a flapper from my daddy. Shall we play with them? Okay, that sounds great. This is my flapper.
So this is a falling tone.
Show you how to play with a flapper. This flapper is really fun. Wow, I would love to have one too. Here is my other toy. I'll show you how to play with it too. It's very interesting.
Okay, so I'm going to try to skip to the test,
Cool.
as fun as this is to watch.
Do you want to play with that? This. Which one is the flapper?
So that was a falling tone, so that's a correct pronunciation.
Find the flapper.
Another falling tone.
You find it. Find the flapper.
That was a rising tone,
You find it.
I think. It's pretty subtle too. Okay. Okay, and then the Mandarin context. Okay, so that was the rising tone. Fee, poo. That was a falling tone. And a rising tone.
漂亮吧
So after we had exposed children to these two, so we familiarized them with the word in either the English or the Mandarin context, and the order was counterbalanced. And then after each training in the particular language, then we tested their recognition of the word in two different cases. So in one, there was the original tone. So in the English case I showed you, that would be the falling tone, kla fa. And then in the other half of trials, the tone was mispronounced. So then they heard kla fa. And so we're again looking at so just like with adults, we're interested in where they're looking on the screen as they're listening to the word. And we can determine whether they're looking more at the target object or at the distractor object. And so the distractor object in this case, it was the object that was equally present during the training, but Lily was never labeling it. And with children, we're using what we call a poor man's eye tracking method, where we don't have this sophisticated eye tracking technology that uses a laser to identify where people are looking. So what we do instead is we just have a remote camera that's recording the child's face as they're looking back and forth. And so we just take the video of the child's face and code it after the experiment to determine where they're looking at each moment in time. And then again, just like with adults, we average over a time window that starts a little bit later and ends a little bit later than with adults, because children tend to be slower at processing this information. So what we predicted, if the bilingual children are able to adjust their pitch processing to the particular language context, then bilinguals in the Mandarin context, they should be doing a pretty good job of identifying the target object when they hear the original tone that was taught. So again, this is the amount of time they're looking at the target object that the word is labeling minus the amount of time they're looking at the competitor. But their looking to the target should go down quite a lot when the tone is mispronounced. And that decrease will indicate that they are treating the tone as an important component of the word, and when it's mispronounced, they think it's a worse version of the word, and they're more likely to look away from the picture that the word would normally refer to and look over at the distractor. In contrast, bilinguals in the English context should look like English speakers in the English context. So both groups of children should not treat tone mispronunciations as relevant, as phonologically relevant. So they shouldn't show this decrease in looking at the picture that the word is associated with. And my previous work suggests that actually they might look a little bit more at the target object. In my previous work with English-speaking children in an English language context, we found this result, and we interpreted it as just kind of a perk-up effect, more like an attentional effect, where they've been familiarized with this really consistent pitch pattern over this long training. And so when they get a new pitch pattern, they just kind of perk up and they're more attentive in general in the task. That was our best explanation of this pattern. So I predicted that we might find that again. I'm going to show you first the results so far with bilinguals and English speakers in the English context. So far so good. The pattern looks like what we might have predicted based on my earlier work, where children are looking actually a little bit more at the target object when the pitch pattern changes, which is, again, not a pattern that you would predict if children are treating tone as an important component of the word. So if their experience with language has taught them that pitch patterns can be lexically relevant. However, we get the same pattern with bilinguals in the Mandarin context so far. So that was not expected, and it's really surprising given that these children, if they know, they've been learning Mandarin since birth, so if they learned the words robustly, they should have then been surprised when the tone changed, and they should have treated that as a worse version of the word. Yes?
Do you have any longitudinal data? I mean, younger children, older children?
We're only testing this age range, 3 to 4-year-olds, but there is some previous work with infants, but it's not in word learning per se, so it's not looking at meaning, so not learning a word that's paired with a meaning. But things like if you familiarize children with the sound of a word and then you change the pitch later. So actually my collaborator Leher Singh has a project where she shows that she shows a developmental change where Mandarin learning children do continue to treat those changes in the pitch pattern as, they'll fail to recognize a word if you change the pitch, whereas English learning children don't. But this is a different task. It's more complicated. We're trying to teach a meaning as well. So, so part of what my work is focused on is kind of a distinction between this early perceptual change and later interpretive. So the need to interpret acoustic information kind of flexibly as you're processing language. So there is evidence that tones may undergo this perceptual reorganization early in infancy, and for that, I think it's somewhere around 9 months. But despite that, with both tones and consonants and vowels, we see kind of a discontinuity where you find that perceptual change early on, but then that doesn't necessarily translate into interpreting words and deploying your knowledge of the native language sounds. Okay, so these initial results suggest that both bilingual and English-speaking preschoolers are actually identifying the target picture somewhat better when the tone is mispronounced, which again is not what we expected in the Mandarin context. And this is very hot off the presses data, so I have spent this week mulling it over and looking at it in different ways, and so I'd love if you have suggestions or thoughts about this. One thing that I wondered was whether there might be contamination from the strongly English-like words that might be affecting children's interpretations of the Mandarin words, or the potentially Mandarin word. We did, as I mentioned, we counterbalanced the presentation of the English word, the word in the English context, and the word in the Mandarin context, and I did look at whether I could see order effects. And there wasn't a strong connection. So, like, for instance, if I analyzed just the first block to try to avoid this contamination, that didn't, it wasn't the case that the bilinguals in the Mandarin context were showing sensitivity to the tone in the pattern you would expect if you only look at when they learned the Mandarin word before the English word. But I do have evidence from a case where we didn't have these strongly English words present at all in the experiment. So I mentioned that with the adults, we initially we designed what I'm calling these Mandarin compatible words initially to be equally compatible with English and Mandarin. And so with the children, we also ran a group of children, I think 36 children, in a version where we were teaching them words pulled from that set in both the English context and the Mandarin context. So there we were controlling the consonants and vowels of the word, whether, so they were supposed to be equally compatible with English and Mandarin, and what we were changing was just the extra stuff. So in the videos, the fact that the person Lily was talking to was either Caucasian or Asian, as much as puppets can be, can have a race. And the language context was either Mandarin or English. So in that case, when we look at children's responses, when the words were all potentially compatible with Mandarin, regardless of that broader language context, we don't see the same pattern where they seem to be perking up and looking more at the target when you change the pitch pattern, which is this pattern that seems to be the sort of stereotypical pattern for people processing in an English context. So we do see this difference, which, I mean, it's not exactly a response to the tone in and of itself, but it is different from this other pattern we see with the other three groups. So here I'm just collapsing. So now I'm just collapsing across the two language contexts. So I'm just looking at bilinguals who had English-like words in their training at some point, and bilinguals who were learning ambiguous words, and just looking at their responses in general, assuming that they're not able to shift within the experiment between the two language contexts. But the fact that this is different suggests that maybe we're finding some impact of just the presence of these really strongly English-like words on children's responses. But I mentioned that if that were the case, you would think that when I looked at just the first block of trials, that would eliminate this contamination, because the English-like words can only affect processing of the Mandarin words when the English-like words came first. But I have another suggestion, a suggestion of another factor at play, that sensitivity to this English-like or Mandarin-like within-word context might develop slowly over the experiment. So when I look at just the second block, so regardless of whether it was an English context or a Mandarin context, if you look at just the second block of training and test trials, then we actually do see the predicted pattern. But again, this is collapsing over the two language contexts. So regardless of whether they're learning these words in an English context or a Mandarin context, it's just bilinguals who had English-like words in their training at some point versus bilinguals who were learning only these potentially Mandarin words. And when bilinguals are learning potentially Mandarin words throughout the experiment, when we just look at their responses as a whole, they show the predicted decrease in target looking when the tone is mispronounced. Whereas bilinguals, when there are English-like words present at some point, show this really strong perk-up effect when the tone is mispronounced. So this suggests that perhaps, perhaps children are showing some sensitivity to the within-word context, so whether the phonotactics are strongly suggesting they're in an English context or could be compatible with Mandarin. But we're really only seeing it when I look at, when I collapse across the language context within the experiment for each child, and when I look at just the second block of trials. So these are very tentative findings, but I'm going to propose some possible conclusions from this that will motivate where we go next with this research project. So we know that children are not using the extra word context, so whether the language being spoken is Mandarin or English, and whether the interlocutor puppet is Caucasian or Asian. So they're not using that information to interpret the tone patterns. And that's actually what we found for adults too. So I mentioned that with the adult study, study 1, in an experiment in a manipulation I didn't show you, we initially tried manipulating whether the participant was speaking with the research assistant in Mandarin or English and hearing the words, these ambiguous words in Mandarin or English carrier phrases during the experiment, and that didn't bias adults' responses. But for children, it appears that if English-like words are present at any point in the experiment, that seems to be inhibiting their attention to tone. And so that may represent some sensitivity to the language context. And again, that finding would converge somewhat with what we found with adults, where adults were using that within-word phonotactic and phonological information to interpret the words as either English or Mandarin. And this account would make sense if children are figuring out how to interpret pitch patterns over a slow time course throughout the experiment. So it seems that if they are, so they seem to be showing a differential interpretation of the tone patterns when the words are English-like versus Mandarin-like, but that seems to be showing up in the second block of trials. Yes? Right, so, yeah.
In one case, there are English-like words in the story.
Right.
I don't understand.
Yeah, so I'm making a distinction between whether the context outside of the word, so we're trying to teach them a particular word, and that word has certain consonants and vowels and phonotactics, and then it's also being taught within a broader context. And so the bullet number 1 is indicating the broader context. So when basically when we tried to shift children's processing or interpretation of tone depending on whether they were whether they had learned the word in an English context or a Mandarin context in terms of the broader context outside the word, they weren't showing differential processing of the tone depending on which context they'd learned the word in. What they seem to be showing is differential interpretations depending on whether at some point in the experiment they learned words that where the word itself has consonants and vowels that could only be English. So it's convergent with what we found with adults, where we were able to shift their processing when the consonants and vowels of the word were only compatible with English versus potentially compatible with Mandarin, but that broader context didn't seem to impact them. but the second possibility, as I mentioned, there are some caveats because if our lack of a finding with Mandarin context is due to contamination from these really English-like words, which are just telling children like tone is not important here, you're hearing really English-like words, we would have thought that I would have expected to see a clear effective order where if you present them with these really English-like words, then they say, okay, tone's not important, and then they ignore tone in the Mandarin words as well. And it wasn't quite that clear cut with the timing of the two blocks. But when I did see differences in just between the children who heard these really English-like words and the children who were only hearing ambiguous words that could have been Mandarin words, I saw those differences in the second block, regardless of which language context that was. So if it's possible the children are just kind of taking a while to decide whether Lily is kind of a tone language speaker or an intonation language speaker. And so by the second block of trials, they've just decided, this puppet uses tones or this puppet doesn't use tones, and that decision was based on whether they at any point had heard Lily using really English-like words or not. It is a good point that Massimo made, though, that all the children have heard Lily speaking in English. So yeah, this account is dependent on the differences between the target words and how children are interpreting this new word, which clearly is, it is the most important word that we're teaching them. We're repeating it over and over, and it's associated with a new object. But even so, they are still getting information from the extra word context. So that's a good point. I do think that so in our future work, as we design a follow-up to this study, since it does appear that we may be finding some contamination between when children are exposed to these really English-like target words, it's inhibiting them from paying attention to tone in the Mandarin-like words. There are a few things we could do to reduce that contamination. So one possibility is that we could present the two language contexts on different days to each child. So we had presented these, we had really wanted to teach each child a word in both language contexts, and that was mainly because it's much harder to assess preschoolers' language dominance and language experience than it is for these adults, where we can have them answer lots of questions. So if we want to try to maintain that design and keep that manipulation of language context within each participant, one possibility to reduce contamination between the English and Mandarin would be to present the two language contexts, for instance, on different days. Another possibility is to just give up on the idea of doing this within subject and just test children between subjects, which actually was my initial bias, but we were very worried about differences between the groups based on their language proficiency and language dominance. So this is between subjects is the way I designed the adult study, but we were able to collect very thorough language dominance information from the adults. And for children, we collected parental reports, but my collaborator felt they were not very, not particularly valid. And then we ended up relying on a research assistant's 5-minute conversation with the child in each language, and so she would just deem them proficient enough in both languages to be included. So that's how children were included. And we do have this parental report information, but we aren't sure, how valid it is. It's more difficult than adults, where we have these clear procedures in place where we can do the vocabulary assessments that have been normed and do the questionnaire that's been normed. Yes. Yes, this is my last slide, so I just wanted to acknowledge my colleagues and funding sources that supported this research. Thanks.